This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, got it. Well, welcome everyone. We really appreciate you being here. As you know, we had originally had Charlie Hunsinger to speak with us. Unfortunately, he was called out of town, but the great news is we have Damon Moore who will speak with us this evening, and he's loaded with a lot of good information. Damon will share his experience as a lead in the extreme restoration project of Robinson Preserve. And Damon, a restoration ecologist with Environmental Science Associates, is a certified ecological restoration practitioner through the Society of Ecological Restoration. He currently serves as president of the Manatee Fish and Game Association and is active with the Florida Native Plant Society. Damon enjoys fishing, hiking, volunteering, and habitat restoration projects. He also worked with Manatee County for, I believe, about 10 years, but he's very experienced and he's a wealth of information. And I think Damon might even be able to share a little bit why he got interested in this whole field of restoration. Damon, we turn it over to you.
Well, I'm gonna first of all make sure I get this shared again just to make sure that's working.
Okay.
So do we have a presentation up for everybody?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, I feel better because I had taken it down thinking I would surely get it. Now I got nervous again. So thank you all for inviting me to present to this. As Ruth said, this project and a lot of projects in Manatee County have really been near and dear to my heart for the last 10 years as an employee for them. And then I'd worked as a consultant on a lot of these projects for about another 7 or 8 years before that. So nearly 20 years experience working on these habitat restoration projects that were mostly undertaken by Manatee County, but had also have done a lot of other things kind of on my own and on the side through Manatee Fish and Game. And we have our lovely Mary Lynn representative here with that today too. But I was, I grew up in Manatee County. I went to school here. I was actually born in Georgia, but spent all my summers here because my grandparents and great-grandparents and parents all were right here in Manatee County. But apparently my grandparents were giving my parents too much advice on my older brother's upbringing. So they went off to Georgia for me and my younger brother, but we ended up coming back when I was about 11. So I claim Florida as home and Manatee County as home. Have always had a thing for being outside and being out in nature, involved with fishing. One of my first ever restoration projects was actually at Leffis Key back in the early 1990s as part of a school field trip where somebody came out and talked about how, you put these mangroves in the ground, it's good for the fish. And a light kind of clicked off, and I've been lucky because I've kind of known this is the kind of work I've wanted to do for most of my life and have kind of pursued it and been really lucky to be able to work on the projects I do. So enough about me. I'll talk about this really cool project we did at the Robinson Preserve. This is going to be about the expansion area. And pardon me for the misnomer on the location here. Oh. Now I've got a little bit of a delay on the slides. Okay, there we're back. So I'll go over a summary of the project. I'm going to talk about how this project specifically took into consideration design aspects for juvenile snook and why. How this was the first project that Manatee County had worked on where we really were taking into consideration, sorry, wrong button. We're taking into consider future conditions of, sea level rise and those sorts of things. And I'll tell you a little bit about some really exciting research that's going on behind this to kind of see if all of these things we were claiming we were going to do with this project, if those were actually going to get done. So probably don't have to tell this group so much, but this is where it is, Northwest Bradenton, right at the confluence of two national estuaries, Sarasota Bay to the south and Tampa Bay to the north. This is the expansion area itself was 150 acres, which was added to the 487, I think it was, 487 existing acres of Robinson Preserve. This project brought that total acreage up to over 700 because we had to add some other parcels to be able to do this project as well. So it really grew the preserve. Just a little bit of history on this site. So we did not start from a place of wonderful ecological condition on a lot of these coastal properties. We start from a pretty nasty mess. So on this slide, I have a series of historical aerials that kind of show you what was going on there over the years. And you see this one on the far left here, 1940 aerial. Even on this one, you can see this signature here, and these are row crops. So this was in agricultural production, even way back in 1940, but you can still see this kind of bumpier, darker signature here and here. This is the signature of native habitats. So back then there still were a little bit else there. Another interesting tidbit about this is this little rectangle right here. This piece of property is called the Winston Tract. I'm sorry, this is called the Reasoner Tract. This one was actually leased by the Reasoner family. It's a pioneering nurseryman family in Manatee County who traveled the world finding neat things that would grow here and they could sell to people, including that really beautiful Christmassy plant called Brazilian pepper. So this may well be ground zero for Brazilian pepper plants. They typically, most of their property was out in the Oneiko area, but they leased this because it was closer to the coast and provided some freeze protection for some of the more tropical plants they were bringing in from all over the world. So interesting mix of plants that are still out there because a lot of like the ficus and stuff grew up. So if you're out on that site and you go where the nature center is and then in the playground with all the kind of canopy walk stuff, that's in all of those exotic trees in there. So we left it because it was a lot of shade and there's some historical significance to that, but the Brazilian pepper and Australian pine trees that were in there came out. So anyway, sorry, moving on, the 1970s aerial. By this one, because it is a coastal site and they had been farming on it, some of the high tides kept coming up and basically killing off the tomatoes. So they had abandoned it for farming. And with that abandonment, this darker signature here, this all transitioned over into Australian pine trees. So most of you guys might know those from the beach and know how lifeless an Australian pine tree is. So from an ecological standpoint, by 1970, there weren't native habitats left on this site. It had all been transitioned over to agriculture of one sort and then left fallow and then turned into a basically 150 acres of exotic species mess. Moving forward another 30 or 40 years, the 2010 aerial, this was about 2 years before the county acquired the property. You can see there's these little signatures out here. It had been cleared and mowed, but these signatures here are actually dredge spoil placement that was put there when the original project was built, with the assumption that this was going to turn into a award-winning golf course community. So this slide shows that. This is really what almost happened with this piece of property. They had the entitlements in place, the permits were ready to go. These were the permitted plans included. You can see that same kind of shape here. A nice golf course. They had it designed by some big name in golf. I don't know the golf thing, but Charlie was telling me that it was going to be a pretty big deal. So it was really ready to look like the picture on the right, houses and golf courses. With the collapse in the economy in 2007, 2008, that really put the brakes on things. And then working with the Robinson family, as the original Robinson Preserve really gained in popularity and kind of turned into a real community value, I really think that had a lot to do with kind of the legacy issues with that. So there were some discussions between Charlie and a couple of other folks on, how with, no money, how can we make something like this happen and pick this up, and instead of having it go to development, have it be in addition to the park. So basically from there, we went from these two different pictures. And so the one on the left is the 2014 aerial. This was after the county purchased it. And the one on the right here is the 2021, where you can see a lot of work had been done. There was a lot of estuarine creation here. And there was good reason for that. A lot of people don't really understand how low value a field of exotics is, because those plants all come from other parts of the world. So at that very lowest level of ecosystem function, the insects can't use the plants. So they're not going to be there. So if you don't have the insects, you don't have the birds, and on up the food chain. So ecologically, it's very poor. So to try and restore these back to the original habitats that were in this, which would have been coastal pine flatwoods, it would be a really nice thing to do. But the issue with that is that coastal pine flatwoods is one of the most functional or vegetatively diverse habitats in the world. Like, it's up there with like rainforest with the plant diversity there. You can't buy a lot of those plants that a native system would have. It requires recurring fire to maintain it that way. It would require an army of staff to be able to manage the exotics that would come in from all the neighborhoods around it. It would be very isolated, and it would be very small. So given those realities, we really wanted to try and restore this back to habitats that complemented the existing areas and replaced some regionally depleted habitats. And really an important pragmatic part of it was that they would be manageable by the staff that are already stretched really thin. They have about 20 people that manage about 25,000 acres. So in the grand scheme of things, 150 acres here on the coast, while it's very loved by the public, they've got a lot of other stuff they need to be doing. So when you introduce a lot of estuarine habitats that have the saltwater function to it, pepper trees don't grow in saltwater. So anywhere you see the water, you don't have any exotics problems in there at all. And those are something that's very easy to manage, and you don't have to constantly be staying on top of that with the exotics treatments. So this is a really important slide because nothing happens without money, and this costs a lot of money. So the total cost of this entire project was $17.6 million. This includes the land acquisition, the habitat restoration, and the biggest chunk of that was the user amenities, which includes like parking lots and nature centers and playgrounds and having to run sewage and electricity and all those things that end up costing a lot of money pretty quickly. But the part that I was in charge of was the habitat restoration component. So just a little bit of background on how this did come to be was that the Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast started working with the county to try and figure out how to put together the $3.2 million that was the asking price by the Robinson family to pick up the other 150 acres. And $3.2 million for 150 acres of upland in a coastal setting is an absolute steal. Even back then, that was a huge gift that I'm sure they were able to write off and do what they do, but it gave us an opportunity. What had to be done was to try and figure out how to come up with $3.2 million. So the Mosaic Foundation, the same Mosaic that does all the mining out east, came up with $3.2 million and said, here, Conservation Foundation, here's $3.2 million. You go acquire that piece of property. So a lot of people groan when they hear Mosaic Foundation, but that was the source money that really got the ball rolling on this thing and allowed the county to acquire this. So actually the Conservation Foundation purchased it, and then they donated it to Manatee County, but they wanted to be sure that Manatee County turn this into a habitat restoration project and nothing else. So when they donated it, it included a conservation easement that in a lot of words said, thou shalt restore this and make it a public park. So with that initial $3.2 million, we started using that as the matching funds to start going after grants. We approached the Southwest Florida Water Management District. They did a cooperative funding for another $3.2 million to really handle most of the earth moving work. That was not going to do the whole project. So we worked with a bunch of other ones. We were able to secure $1.5 million in Restore Act funding through NOAA. And that one was kind of special because that one went to what they called their Restore Council. And it was a special selected project. They really, really liked this one. So they funded that separate from all the other Restore dollars that went to the county. So this was basically in addition to the other Restore funding that went to Manatee County. And then we worked with a whole bunch of different other agencies that are all listed there below to be able to kind of cobble together the rest of this and make this thing work in total. So I'm going to breeze through this part because while it's awesome and I love that people go out there and use it, it's not the part I care about that much. This is really more important for the folks that I'll be presenting to in a couple of weeks so that they know what else is out there. I will say though that from, when I started working at Manatee County, I was very much a nature preserve is a bunch of woods and a gap in the fence for somebody to walk through. And then really seeing how this property is used and how people interact with it and how it gets so many kids and, out here and interacting with nature, it really kind of landed on me that is a really important component of this. And when the environmental lands referendum came through, and this was like the poster child of we were, during the campaign of that and the polling, people kind of responded that like, well, we want more Robinson preserves. We like that. So it's a really powerful tool to really get people to appreciate and fund doing more of that. So hopefully more of that is coming in the near term. So on that site, you saw the photos before. This is what that looks like kind of on a plan set as we kind of get going. This was what evolved from a bunch of basically program meetings and then highlighters, and then it turned into this and eventually all the way to engineering drawings and permit drawings and everything else. But I call this the organ diagram. This basically shows what kind of habitats are where and has all the acreages. If you ever really just got to know more about exactly everything that's out there, give me a call or let's go out there and have a walk. That's really the best way to see this and see where those differences are. Some of this you won't be able to tell for another 10 or 15 years until the plants that define these habitats really start getting a little bit bigger. So a really important part of this project for me in particular, but also for the funding agencies, and we really tried to include this because we knew we weren't going to have enough money to do this on our own. So we needed to have something that was important to our local area that supported the economic values of this area, but we're also tied to, this is very pragmatic, but also tied to fisheries that were supported by the National Marine Fisheries Service under NOAA, because we knew they were going to have money, and that if you could have a fisheries component benefit to your project, that they would be more likely to fund it. So me growing up catching snook, I had no problem doing this. So it was really important to me because on a lot of projects throughout the area, we would, dig these basins and say, yes, this must be providing good habitat for juvenile snook because we caught some in there. The whole thing is a little bit more complicated than that. So I worked with basically did the call out to every snook fisheries expert in the Southeast and said, okay, you've dedicated your life to studying these things. I'm a person that pushes these projects forward and make sure that they're based on the best available science. Let's make sure there's not a gap between the science and the practice. So way before these drawings all started to get made, we had like 4 or 5 really good stakeholder meetings with some of the biggest brains there are that have literally dedicated their life to the study of these fish, so that the design really met the needs to the best it possibly could. So it was more information than most people would ever want to try to sort through that they threw, because everybody has to give, you know, their papers and their thoughts on it. So in working with them, I boiled this down into 6 primary needs to design for. And I'll go through these each in the next couple of slides, but the 6 of them are listed there and you guys can all read. So I'll just move on. So need number 1 is the proximity to life cycle habitats. Basically what that means is if you're going to get juvenile snook in here, you have to be within proximity to a snook spawning area, which typically occurs in the passes, and in the mouth of the river is a big one. So given the proximity to the mouth of the river, and what we saw in some other ponds that we sampled, we knew that we would be able to get juvenile spawning fish, or juvenile larval fish into these areas. The other thing they need is they need to have fringing habitats, so that after that first year of life, they can move out of the backwaters and then be kind of in the kind of protected bay areas. And luckily for us in this area, we're completely surrounded by a lot of really good habitat like that. So this was a really interesting one for me, was because a big part of this is kind of working down trophic levels. So it's one thing to get the structure right for the juvenile snook themselves, but a lot of this design was based off of designing to create habitats that provided food for what the snook eventually ate. So basically food for the food. What that really all boiled down to is that we want to create a lot of conditions and surface areas that grow periphyton, which is this little scummy stuff that grows on woody vegetation. That's what it's basically a mixture of like algae and bacteria, but that's what the invertebrates that the juvenile snook like to eat. So that's a mouthful. So a lot of this design occurred, like a lot of wavy shoreline edges, everything was planted right away. It included putting a lot of woody vegetation into these newly created water bodies. You can see the photo up on the top right here. This was taking some old Australian pine trees that we had in some areas, and then instead of having to pay to haul those out, we just took those and put those out into the water. And that's a whole lot of surface area to grow these and provide that structure and complexity of habitat. So another really important part of this was energy conservation. And this was, I was really glad that, we brought all the scientists in, because this definitely wouldn't have been something that was directly on my mind. But in these backwater habitats that first year of life happens for a snook, if they have to spend all their energy holding themselves in place or fighting against waves and currents, that's more food that they're having to get, and less productivity they're putting into growing and getting through that first year successfully. So these habitats were created with a lot of these kind of narrow water bodies with kind of high banks on each side to protect those areas from wind, so you don't have some these big expanses of wavy areas and areas with high velocity currents. So another issue is that you need to have variation to provide thermal refuge on the site. So you need deeper pooling areas when the water gets hot, so they can get out of that and get cool. But when the water gets cold, you need to have open, flat, sunny areas, so that you can have warmer areas, just so that they can move in between these things, so that they can survive and not have to move out of the system as a whole. So we achieve that with, as you can see, there's deeper areas like this here, which kind of, oh, sorry, did it again. So this area is about 6 feet deep, and then it kind of comes up quick to this, which is all about 1 to 1.5 feet deep on an average tide. So, and the other thing is a lot of variability in bottom color. We did that with different kinds of surfacing and then creating pinch points at certain areas where the tidal flows would not allow settling of any kind of algae or anything in that. So you can see like in between this bridge where that water speeds up, a lot of people see there's like a sill there. This is that sill that's meant to speed that water up among some other things. But that was not something that I would have been thought of, and really glad that we had the input from the scientific community to be able to incorporate that into this design here. This one, probably the most important. This is for the juvenile snook, it's protection for predators. So that first year of their life, that's when they're from about, you know, 1 millimeter to about 3 centimeters in length. In that time, they are a tasty little morsel. A larger snook, a jack, all kinds of predatory fish will just eat those things. So the natural habitats they live in are these backwaters that are physically separated from the larger open water bodies where you have more predatory fish, because they can get back there, and then when there's a storm tide, they know that they need to move at that point. They're programmed to know that after that first year of life, and they've grown that bit, they can get out there, they can swim faster, they can get away. But if you don't have that physical barrier, then you get all sorts of predatory fish like jacks and ladyfish and even adult snook that will eat all the small ones. So this is a bit of a challenge on a site like this. So we tried to, as best we could, accomplish this with the sills by planting a lot of mangroves in front of these kind of areas so that those roots act as that physical barrier. We're still working through a little bit of that because some of those, sorry, I keep doing that. Some of those mangroves in the middle of this thing actually did live. And then the other way of doing this is to create the open water connection so that it is truly ephemeral and really only has that connection during like high tidal events. So these two pictures on the left are examples of that, where on a high tide, you can see this whole thing floods open, but on most days, this thing will go completely dry. So this isn't something that a lot of fish are going to traverse, but the juvenile fish can get in and out of there with no problem. And this one was a complete surprise to me, was that those little baby snook have sensitive eyes. So they need to have some shade so that they're not constantly exposed to that sunlight all day long. So in a natural system, the mature vegetation along the edges provides that. You can see like in a natural mangrove system, there's a lot of shade that they can move up under here. Our situation now with this being such a new site is our mangroves generally look like this. There's not much for juvenile snook to get into. So one of the ideas being batted around is to provide a couple of floating islands so that you can create some artificial shade kind of in the interim like that. So this is another really important aspect that I think finally everybody seems to be more and more accepting of, that this is a real thing, is that sea level rise is happening. This is the photo here. You can see the tower that most people have been to Robinson, have been out to this tower. This is, you can see it's a sunny day. We have our funding our future public roads and safety to brag about the money we spent on the boardwalks and trails. And the trails are all flooded because we're getting more and more of these high tide days like this. So with the expansion, we wanted to make sure that we did not continue to go down that route, and we had a good way to use the material we excavated to create the snook habitat by elevating not just the trails, but also the habitats, the upland habitats that we were going to be creating out there to provide them some resiliency moving forward. So this is the NOAA's, they have basically a model that shows projected sea level rise outcomes. So this is what this Northwest Bradenton area looks like right now at a mean high water. The blue is inundated. The stuff on the regular aerial is just kind of upland that we have here. So with a projection of an additional 3 feet, you can see most of Perico Preserve, most of Robinson Preserve has now gone underwater. So the projections on these things vary back and forth, but some people say between 50 and 100 years, we might be seeing a 3-foot sea level rise. So we didn't want to have that same situation go on there, to where we're designing for infrastructure and, you know, putting these infrastructure in these lower areas where you have a situation like this. Now, having said that, coastal preserves as a whole is a very good idea to have in these coastal settings, as opposed to gray infrastructure and condos and everything else. Because as you can see from this photo, this set of photographs in a preserve, a lot of the infrastructure is trails and bike racks, those sorts of things. So the picture on the left is a normal day. The picture on the right was when one of the tropical storms came by and flooded out all of these areas. And this was basically about the same level as that model had shown, with about a 3-foot storm surge going through. And with this situation, the bike rack was fine. It didn't even move. The water went down. There was no FEMA reimbursement for any of this. Everything was cool. So in these vulnerable areas like this, preserves are a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. I think that the Robinson project, kind of talking to some other people about this, really serves as a potential future example of what happens when you have repeated coastal flooding events. Eventually, some of those areas would become uninsurable. The most likely thing that would happen there would be a government buyback of those areas. And then the big question is, what do you do with those areas? So the Robinson project kind of shows that, you know, there are things you can do here that involve moving a lot of earth material around, recreating these systems, and it becomes really a benefit for the community. So this is a picture of what those new trails look like. So instead of being at elevation 2, the top ends of these trails are at elevation 25. So these may well be island trails out there after things behind the park floods and hopefully many years in the future. But also very important to me is that the habitats that we were restoring out there, you can see the photo on the right, there's a lot of, this section we planted heavily in cedar to try and recreate some cedar hammock, which is a habitat that it shows up in our community maps that actually was a habitat, but was lost because we used it to line closets and build pencils and everything else, and harvested those hammocks away. So this area, it's elevated, it should be fine even when storms come by. So this is really an important part of this if you're interested in really what's going on there. There are multiple different scientific studies that are going on out there, specifically to look, a lot of it's looking at the fish population. They're doing some very, very detailed sampling with net samples. They're doing immigration studies where they're tagging some of the fish. And then there, you can see, like, if you go out there to the preserve now, you see these like weird antenna things that are set up all over out there. That's they're tracking the movement to see if these things are actually getting out and where they, what their habitat preferences are within the preserve. Anytime you create a bunch of inland waterways, there's an opportunity to learn more about those hydrodynamics and how that water moves around those systems. And if the models we use to make sure we didn't impact additional areas were actually working like they're supposed to. And then in the next year or two, there's going to be the start of a socioeconomic study to really kind of and quantify the community impact from everything from just kind of giving people a place to get out and exercises and bringing a community together and try and quantify some of that value. And I really have to give my hats off to one of my colleagues that with NOAA. Her name is Chris Kaufman. I was kind of really clear with her on the front end of this, that for my role in these projects, I will work really hard and get the project done, but I consider myself a restoration practitioner, not a restoration scientist. So when I get one project done, I'm moving on and doing the next project, not setting up and doing a study on it for the next 10 years. I love the studies. I need the studies. There's other people better at that. And I told her, like, there's a ton to learn here. She was able to get through a whole bunch of different entities, over $700,000 put together. That wasn't county money, that was just from other entities that saw the opportunities to learn from this. And those studies are all going on now. There's a really cool, that was a month or two ago that the county put on this this little presentation that had like a summary of each of these. That's recorded online. If you just go to that address there, I can send a link to that later because I can't get it to work on this. But or if you just go to YouTube and Google search the science of Robinson Preserve, it'll pop up. So that's really interesting. That's, you know, thing that's going on there. And then again, the implementation team, there was a whole lot of people that kind of came together to design this and construct it. The fisheries input people came out of the woodwork to be able to do it. It was interesting to me how satisfied a lot of these people were that a restoration practitioner was actually reaching out to get this information from them. So it worked really well. It was kind of an exercise to get them to communicate in practical terms and have them understand that, you know, what might be ideal and what's actually pragmatic, because we have other design considerations, you know, with the engineering to be able to get a permit. But it came together really nicely, and I'm kind of forever indebted to these people that all gave a whole lot of good input on that. So with that, that's really the short version. I really like, there's so much more to talk about there, but it would be really cool to do this and have a field trip follow it up sometime too. So anyway,
that would be great. We do have a couple of questions here. I don't know if you have seen them, but one was from Alice. Have you done presentations for the Board of County Commissioners, and what different county employees have had something like this presentation?
So I have done multiple, I mean, as an employee, I was presenting to them at Board of County Commissioner meetings and at Council of Government meetings, and then individually with briefings and that sort of things. I mean, if they're going to have to, you know, they have to, anytime we get a grant agreement, they have to sign off on it. So obviously they're going to need to know what's going on there. So these kinds of projects, so there's somebody else in my role there now. Her name is Sherry Swanson. She's awesome. She's working on some of these projects and like pushing forward still some of the other ones that I was working on that I had been able to get grant funding for, but then decided to move on and try the consulting world again. But I mean, they know of these things. They love to come out to the ribbon cuttings and those sorts of things when all the politicians come out and do that part too. So
Mary Lynn pointed out that it might be interesting to show the proposed golf course community with the sea level rise. I don't know, and you'd have to do some kind of a hypothetical, I think, but the assumption being, I think that it would be underwater, a lot of it, right?
Most likely. Eventually it would be, for sure. So
Yes.
Yeah, very good. Now, were there other questions from any of our audience here? Oh, here's a question. Oh, you added that. Have you involved WEDU PBS educational programming, Tampa and Sarasota? And this is from Eileen Topper.
I personally have not. This did get, you know, bits and pieces of this certainly got a lot of attention. That we did a salt marsh planting about a year and a half ago that was picked up by the local NPR affiliate, and then they really liked the way that thing went out, and they ended up running the story about marsh plantings at Robinson Preserve across the whole country too. So that was pretty neat. But so that, I mean, I get pulled into a lot of that stuff because I love talking about it. And there's a education and outreach group at Manatee County that's headed up by Aiden Stockdale. And they do a lot of that. And what, one really cool thing too is that they are constantly doing programs and bringing kids out and telling them about this and giving them opportunities to get involved and lay a hand, plant some marsh grasses, that sort of stuff. And they tailor it really well to what these different groups can do. And really it's such an important part of it, because it really physically makes them a stakeholder in a piece of property. So I did a similar, the Perico Preserve Restoration Project was one of mine that I had done before this Robinson one. And one of the things that I always remember about that was, I was working on that in I think this was about 2015, and we had a Boy Scout group out, and it was like 4 of them, but they were into it. So we put them out, and we had them doing some transplanting of these Spartina clumps. So flash forward, 7 or 8 years, and I'm out there looking at something at Perico Preserve, and I see these suspect looking teenage kids, and I was like, wow, these kids remind me a lot of myself. I don't trust them. So I kind of like swanter on over there, and I see them just kind of staring off in this area, and then as soon as I can hear their voices, they're like, yeah, that's the area we planted. And I was like, oh my God, that's so awesome. They weren't, trying to hide something or burying a body somewhere. They were trying to find the plants that they put in the ground out there. So that one, it's awesome to me, because, I've done this with those kind of projects, with the oyster projects, where we've had volunteers build oyster bars out in these preserves. And it's always so cool when, like, you're just like walking down a trail and you hear some, hey, remember back when we did that? And it's like, there it is. It's stuck. Nature matters to you now. It's important.
Yes. To actually have hands-on.
Yeah,
absolutely. So Ellis had a question. What other entities use your services? What other kinds of projects?
So as a consultant now, I do a lot of work for government agencies. I'm working on projects all the way from coastal Alabama all through this area. My network is in this area, so I'm still doing some work for like the estuary programs. I'm still doing some contract work for Manatee County, doing a couple of really cool projects out at MacDill Air Force Base, doing some marsh creation on some really tore up areas out there, working for the city of Treasure Island, doing a living shoreline. So anybody who will pay for it, basically. But that's, I say that, but there's a lot, like, especially through Manatee Fish and Game, we still do a lot of, like, the Bowleys Creek Island at the mouth of Bowleys Creek. It's a little bird sanctuary island that the Audubon Society, who manages it, they really don't have the time or the money to mess with that one, because it doesn't have a nesting colony on it. So, like, I've loved that little island since I was a little kid, and through Fish and Game, we've been able to kind of get grants and kind of keep up with that. We did another one with Fish and Game called Mariposa Key up in Bishop Harbor. So like I do it because I love it, but I also need to make a living. So the consulting world works well for me, and it also gives me access to a lot of cool projects.
And Mary Lynn was saying, let's ask about the Mariposa project. What can you share about that briefly?
So
what was it?
It's a cool story, actually. So me and a friend of mine named Adam, when we worked together in the same field, he had just moved to this area from Colorado, and it was my job to introduce him to what fishing was. So we got these little tiny kayaks that we were both way overweight for, and paddled miles out into Bishop Harbor and landed on Mariposa Key. And I'd never been to it before, but we were, as much plant nerds as we were fishing people. So we kind of ended up on this island and saw that, like, this wasn't a spoil island. This had a lot of really cool Florida endemic rarer plants, but beside every one of those was a Brazilian pepper tree or something else that didn't belong. So we kind of once got our bearings, we said, this is at risk of losing something that's really special out here. And it was part of Terracea Preserve State Park. They, of course, had no money. So we were like, well, why don't me and, we know how to kill pepper trees. We can come out here with machetes. And so we had this great idea that we were going to do that. So after like the first 2 hours and seeing how slow we were going and realizing we still had like another 9 acres to go, we started thinking, maybe there's a way we could get a grant for this. So that was my first soiree into the grant funding world. And that's partially how I got connected with Manatee Fish and Game, or at least reconnected with Manatee Fish and Game, was they basically sponsored us as the grant recipient, because we both worked for a private company and they weren't eligible to do it. So Adam went and presented to the Fish and Game folks and kind of begged and pleaded, help us, we can make this happen. And from there, we ended up getting a couple of different grants. It was about, at the time, it seemed absolutely huge to me, because it was like, I don't know, like a total of like $20,000 of grant funding to be able to do this 7 or 8 acres of work out there. But for me personally, the contacts I made, and then the fact that we really did follow through with that and make sure it all got done, really kind of helped boost my career. But it's also just a really cool, special place that we were able to get through and sweep that whole island. And as importantly as getting the initial sweep done, really made it clear to the Park Service that, hey, people are looking at this, you better keep up with it. So they stay on top of it a little bit better now than they might have before. So
some accountability there.
But I say that
So-
I got reconnected back to Manatee Fish and Game because my first involvement, and I love that we still support this, was through the Envirothon competitions. When I was in high school, that was the one academic area that I shined at. Otherwise, it was just baseball and doing stupid stuff. But anything environmental, I was into. So Manatee Fish and Game hosted the Envirothon competitions on their property back then. So that was my first introduction, was way back then in 1992 or 3 or something, whenever,
Wow.
however old
Yeah.
I was back then.
Well, we have one more question, and then we've got a couple of things we're going to have to cover. Do you collaborate with the Nature Conservancy of Florida? And this is from Eileen Toper.
So on some projects, yes. On the Robinson project, there was some coordination that had to happen, because in order for us to do that project, we had to pick up what was called the Winston Tract that was just off of Manatee Avenue. So
Right.
it was owned by the state. We needed to be able to go through and widen out a ditch in it to make the hydraulics work at the Robinson project. So we went in and said, okay, we'll apply for the lease to lease this. But then when we got looking into that, the Nature Conservancy held an easement on the property that said that, they wanted it protected. So they said, nobody can dig up it, nobody can dig anything, nobody can do anything here. So I said, we kind of need to dig a part of it up. So I got to meet with their director and kind of explain the whole Robinson project. And they were supportive of it, and basically viewed our ditch as creation of a nature trail for kayaks. It does much more
That
than that,
works.
but we found a way to make that work. And
Good.
Temperance was awesome. Apart from that, I still work with, there's a woman that works there named Ann Birch, who's just the oyster restoration guru queen. When I started pushing a large oyster restoration project in Manatee County, one of the first things I did was reach out to Ann with the Nature Conservancy and say, I need to know how to, because this is going to be a very foreign concept locally, I need to figure out how to get broad public support for this. So she started telling me kind of some framing issues and how to look into it and start presenting early. So I've been presenting on that one for the past almost 8 years, and it's just now starting to get moving. So,
Well, we will definitely want to have you back to the League of Women Voters to talk about the oysters and the clams. I know that's another whole area of discussion, and I've heard your presentation on that, and it's been excellent. So we'll look at our times and definitely be in touch with you and try to schedule that after the first of the year. How's that sound, Damon?
works for me.